So I want to welcome all of you to our second symposium in honor of the 25th anniversary of our Medical Scholars Program. This symposium follows on the first one. The title of the first one and the discussion of the first one was about medicine and the social contract. In many, many ways, this symposium follows on that, meeting the challenges of diversity and excellence. I am really delighted beyond my expression to show you that delight in words. I am delighted with the speakers for today and what they've chosen to speak about. I want to start by showing one slide, and that is the slide of our mission statement. And before that, I also want to express my thanks and appreciation to Erica Peterson and Elizabeth Rodriguez. These two women have worked tirelessly behind the scenes and in front of the scenes to make these symposium a success. And my appreciation for their efforts is essentially boundless. So to start our symposium, I want to start by reading the mission of our Medical Scholars Program at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. And that is, the GPPA Medical Scholars Program facilitates an excellent liberal arts and engineering undergraduate education, enriched by special College of Medicine programs focused on the profession and scope of medicine and healthcare in the context of the evolution of social justice and the social contract and its fundamental relation to the profession of medicine, to a talented group of students with demonstrated interest in medicine. There are a number of BA/MD programs in America, and to my knowledge, there is no one program that in its mission statement from its beginning has as part of its mission really understanding social justice and the social contract and the relationship of these to health and the profession of medicine. So this symposium today, as was the symposium in October, really elaborates the mission of our program, and I am so happy to be able to do this. In the notes to the program, we have extensive biographies of all of the participants. Therefore, in my introduction, I am not going to read all of their accomplishments. It might take too much time from the 2.5 hours we have scheduled. But our first speaker, Dr. Kenneth Ludmera, is really can really be said to be one of the real giants in understanding the history of contemporary academic medicine. He has written 3 books that are classics, and is in the process of writing a 4th book. The 4th book is called Medicine. Tentatively, it has a title called Medicine in Black and White: The History of Racism in American Medicine or American Medical Education. And he actually, when we've been talking about the symposium, suggested that it would be, he would like to set the scope of today's symposium, and I couldn't be more delighted. Ken is a primary care physician and the Mabel Dorn Reeder Distinguished Professor in the history of medicine at Washington University School of Medicine. He was a graduate of Harvard College, received his medical degree and master's degree in history of medicine from Johns Hopkins, and he is a recipient of the Abraham Flexner Award for Distinguished Service to Medical Education from the AAMC. So with that, Ken, you're on.
Great, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. It's an important topic, very distinguished panel. I'm eager to hear what everyone has to say. And I've long been a great admirer of the University of Illinois College of Medicine and the GPPA program. So for me, it's a real pleasure to be here. I was hoping to set some background to today's conversation. So to jump right into things, if we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's helpful to remember that this is a very broad issue that goes beyond race, even though today's focus has been primarily on race. So if you look through in the 1950s, a classic period in medicine, the profession was 94% male, 98% white, mainly Protestant. And those who entered medicine primarily came from affluent families. So there was a significant class bias in the composition of the profession. All of these issues we have to deal with and have been dealing with. And also in terms of background, the concept of intersectionality can be very helpful, which is a fancy way of saying that people are complex individuals who reflect multiple backgrounds. When we talk about the gender issue, the race issue, the religious issue, people can have more than one of these issues in their own background. One of the most common intersections today is that of Black women physicians, who sociologists have shown to identify much more with women physicians, white women physicians, than with Black male physicians in the profession. I'd like to dig into the issues of religion, class, and gender. So this next slide deals with religious quotas, the significant Catholic and Jewish quotas that afflicted medical education and the profession at one time. For simplicity's sake and for sake of time, I'll largely speak of the Jewish quotas. In the way of context, you'll remember that in the 1880s, waves of immigrants began to reappear in American shores. Ellis Island becomes the place of entry. Millions upon millions entered the United States from the 1880s through the early 1920s. These immigrants were often called the new immigrants because they came primarily from the Mediterranean and eastern portions of Europe, in distinction to earlier European immigrants who were primarily from the Northern Europe and Western Europe. After World War I, there was a great backlash against immigrants. This manifested itself with the Red Scare of 1919, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. And it was in this post-World War I climate that religious quotas were introduced into American medical schools. The first quota, and I'm speaking of Jewish quotas now, was instituted at Harvard Medical School in 1922, where it limited the number of Jews in the entering freshman class to 10%. This 10% quota became widely followed at many schools. Some schools accepted even fewer schools. Not all schools were eager to establish quotas. Quotas were especially prominent in private medical schools. State medical schools were much less conscious of religion. Northeastern and East Coast medical schools were much more likely to have quotas than schools from other parts of the country. University of Illinois, to its credit, was actually quite liberal in this regard, and to my knowledge, never had religious quotas of any sort. Now, as difficult as it was to get into medical school for many talented Jews and Catholics as well, an even greater problem began to appear in the 1930s and thereafter, when graduate medical education started to become important in the training of a physician. It was even harder for a Jew to receive a residency appointment than it was to find a spot in a medical school. And there are many teaching hospitals that would not accept Jews to their residency staff, even Jews who had been at their affiliated medical school as medical school undergraduates. And as one response to this, we find an era of outstanding Jewish teaching hospitals, most notably Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, Michael Reese in Chicago is another example, which rivaled any teaching hospital in the country and were a mecca for talented Jewish medical residents and faculty to receive appointments, having been excluded at other medical schools. The quotas lasted about 3 decades. It was in the 1950s with a revulsion to the atrocities of Hitler's Germany that there was a backlash against anti-Semitism, and you find that the quotas disappear from religious quotas disappear from American medicine at that time. As an irony, as American medicine became more democratic, the plight of Jewish hospitals became worse because many talented Jewish physicians who in earlier times would come to Mount Sinai or Michael Reese or Jewish Hospital in St. Louis now had other options. And many of the Jewish hospitals underwent a decline in their stature and prestige and capacity as a consequence of this democratizing act. Mount Sinai maintained its eminence, but only after it created a medical school. And we can also see similar issues relating to gender. From the late 19th century through 1970, the profession was approximately 6% female, and that was a fairly constant number. There were many women's proprietary schools prior to the Flexner Report of 1910. Only the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania survived the Flexner Report. That school was all women, and then other medical schools generally had a handful of women per admitting class, though there were some medical schools that refused to admit women until the 1960s. In understanding the entry of women into the profession, it's very important to remember that the issue is not just numbers, but the actual experience and opportunities provided. And here, women were subject to all sorts of microaggressions and stereotyping and the humiliation of being called by your first name, whereas your another resident would be called Dr. So-and-so, or being confused with a nurse, or not having adequate call facilities, behavior considered and interpreted as aggressive and admirable in a male being, or assertive and admirable in a male being controlling and aggressive in the female, and lack of mentorship. So it's the conditions of work, not just the number of women or the entry into the profession that matters. This situation began to change around 1970. And this is largely a reflection of the women's movement. By 1980, 40% of the entering classes were female. By 2000, we had parity in the entering classes between male and female students. But the environment continued to be a difficult one and continues that way today in terms of microaggressions, lack of mentoring, lack of opportunities. The biggest challenge today is, in my view, is creating opportunities for women to achieve in academic settings. That women have entered all levels of practice. There are lots of women at junior levels in medical school faculties, but the number of women professors, women NIH grant recipients, women department chairs, women deans, and so forth remains very, very low. And I believe that this is the greatest challenge ahead that we have, getting women into leadership positions, not just into the profession. And I think that the largest single barrier to this is the culture of academic medicine. The modern medical school was created by the same forces that gave rise to the modern university. Both came from the German university. Research was the centerpiece, and there was a publish or perish ethic. And promotions in academic success depended on grants, publications. And it's difficult to do this if you're a woman and have a family. There's an important book called The Second Shift, which goes into detail. It's a sociological analysis. Male academic physicians can work in the evenings because they have spouses or others in general taking care of the children and family. Women academic physicians usually have the task of the second shift to themselves. And of course, this is less hours and direct academically related work. One of the best anecdotes that I came across illustrating this was at a prominent East Coast medical school. A woman in the OBGYN department was being put up by the chair of OBGYN for promotion to associate professor with tenure. She had started off brilliantly with grants, great publications, but had not published for a number of years because she had started a family. She had returned to work, she was publishing again. And the letter of this department chair was so illustrative because it pointed this out and it said, Dr. So-and-so was wonderful originally. She has unlimited capacity. She took time off to start a family. But now that she's returned to work, she's productive again and producing papers as if other activities were not important. And it is this publish or perish culture that needs to be reconciled, I believe, with opportunities for women going forward. And we also have notable class biases in medicine. Before the Flexner report of 1910, the social status of the profession was not particularly high because a person did not have to be particularly distinguished to become a doctor. Entrance requirements consisted only of a high school degree, and in some cases those were waived. Johns Hopkins was the only school to require a college degree for admission. And as a result, many quote unquote poor boys entered medicine, and the proprietary schools of the era gave them that opportunity. But after the Flexner report, for legitimate and important reasons, the proprietary schools closed and rigorous entrance requirements became universal. And immediately there was a shift to the well-to-do with young men and a few women entering medicine, largely from more affluent families. This situation continued for the next 5 decades, and then it began to accentuate in the late 1970s. This was a result of 2 factors. It was in the late 70s that medical school tuition began to soar. And in addition, graduate medical education was now taking more years than before, and hence the opportunity costs of becoming a doctor increased, and the profession became even more slanted toward the affluent classes, with 80–90% of new students coming from the top 5 to 10% of the socioeconomic group. And this is compounded by the lack of scholarship funds that have been available historically in medicine and that remain in scarce supply today. Scholarship funds have always been the great thorn in the side of our academic medical centers. We've done magnificently raising funds for research and for patient care and for the physical complex, but scholarship has been a tough nut to crack in terms of philanthropy. Many potential donors are put off supporting another person's work or career. Andrew Carnegie, who funded the Flexner report and funded so many hospitals and research programs, refused, in his words, to support another man's business. And adding to that has been hits that the medical profession has taken legitimately, in my view, in more recent decades, as their income rises, but as perceptions of greed and malfeasance also increase, it gets difficult to get the public to provide scholarships. And for the remainder of my time, I'm going to focus on the issue of racial equity and racism in medicine. Now, some background might be useful. Much prejudice and discrimination against Blacks has been justified by scientific racism. The idea that from using biology and anthropology to quote unquote prove that Blacks are physically and intellectually inferior to Caucasians. Prejudice has always existed, but the idea of using science to justify a categorization and ranking of different races was new in the 18th century. It continued in the 19th century. And underlying this was power, because scientific racism gave a justification for various policies and structures and systems that served the white society. Though Blacks obviously began their history in this country with great disadvantages, I'm impressed by the numerous examples of success, even in the early days of slavery, where you have brilliant Black poets, scientists, writers, despite the obstacles. One of my favorite stories, just to give an example of this, the Redmond sisters in 1834, two African-American sisters in the North, obviously, in the North, not in the South, who were admitted to a private high school, girls' high school in Salem, Massachusetts. One sister was the number one student in the class, and the other sister was right behind her. And they were expelled from school because their success embarrassed the white students and the white parents. Also, we see from the beginning repeated examples of what I'm calling cultural racism, namely the appropriation of ideas by others. For example, many people today remember the name Cotton Mather, the late 17th century religious leader in Massachusetts, who is credited with his important role in the development of smallpox vaccine for his introduction of the variolization process as a way to prevent smallpox. What people don't know is that the idea was not Mather's. The idea came from a slave of Mather who himself was first generation from Africa, who told Cotton Mather about practices back home in Africa, and Mather took those ideas for his own and got all the credit for this great step forward against smallpox, and of course didn't credit the slave at all. And another aspect of the background that I think is important today is what I've been calling in my own work, the internalization of inferiority. There's a lot of insight into this that comes from psychology, from social psychology, from history, showing how identity formation is established by the ages of 3 or 4, how potent both positive and negative reinforcement can be. And our country has had a history of considering white as good, Black not just as bad, but as inferior. And this was throughout the school system in the 19th and 20th century, the idea that whites did things better. Whites were provided, whites were eligible and capable of higher education, but for Blacks, vocational training only. It was this idea that not only were Blacks not permitted to be doctors, but that they could not be doctors because they were incapable of it. And this notion of inferiority gets internalized. And in my own work, I found to be an extraordinary psychological barrier in terms of bringing about greater racial equity in medicine. And this is culturally determined. And an example of this is in the following quotation. An African pre-medical student at Cornell in 1967 who told the dean of admissions, "Those of us who came from Black countries have an entirely different psychology. When I came here, I did not have any feeling of being inferior or unwanted or anything like that. I was accustomed to the idea that a Black man could be a physician because all the physicians I had ever seen were Black." Here is a skeleton history of the entry of African Americans into the profession. Before the Civil War, there were actually a few Black physicians, not many, but there were a few. The first, Dr. McCabe, was actually received his MD degree in Dublin, Ireland, because American schools wouldn't accept him. There were a handful of Black physicians who got MD degrees in American schools before the Civil War. Often the schools thought that these particular individuals would take their skills and go back to Africa and practice medicine there, but in fact, they stayed in the United States. Most African Americans received medical care if they were in the South on the plantation, alternative healers, midwives. There was a lot of folk medicine, and white doctors would also take care of Black patients. The organized Black medical profession begins to appear after the Civil War. You have a few African Americans studying in traditionally white schools, not many, but a few. But you also have the birth of the proprietary schools, many of which were dedicated to Black students. And schools would come and go, they'd open and they'd close, but there was something like 13 or 14 schools altogether. The most significant were Meharry and Howard, both established after the Civil War, and together trained roughly 90% of the Black physicians in the country. This circumstances continued into the Flexner Report of 1910, and Flexner, for very appropriate educational reasons, called for all proprietary schools to be closed and wanted medical education to be in a high plane. This had many inadvertent consequences, of course, and in terms of Blacks in medicine, all the Black schools closed except Howard and Meharry. Many schools that survived particularly in the South, did not accept Blacks. Others had a token Black or two. And some medical schools, even the North, would not accept Black students. So you see the number of African Americans in the medical profession leveling off at 2 or 3%. And then this circumstances continues from the Flexner report of 1910 through 1965, the civil rights year. This was a period of Jim Crow medicine. There were very few Blacks in medicine. More significant, in my view, was the conditions of work, because if an African-American student could get a position at the University of Illinois or at Washington University or at University of Pennsylvania, such students were likely to encounter all sorts of difficulties in terms of skepticism among the faculty and fellow students, and patients who wouldn't want a Black student to examine them, and inadequate housing and not being able to take meals with the rest, and so forth. And as with the Jews and the Catholics, the problem of residency became, and graduate medical education became a especially important problem, particularly after 1930s, as graduate medical education is becoming important to the education of any physician. There were very few hospitals that would accept Black individuals on their house staffs. So to get a residency, an African-American student was limited to the Hospital of Howard, the Hospital of Meharry, and then half a dozen other Black hospitals, Harlem in New York, Homer G. Phillips in St. Louis. The opportunities were profoundly limited for a Black physician who wanted to be something other than a general practitioner. This situation begins to improve in the mid-1960s with in the wake of the civil rights legislation. In the 1970s, you have affirmative action. So you see more Blacks in medicine. You also have a transformation of racism. You no longer have the overt prejudices that you did during the Jim Crow and the fear of lynching, but all sorts of more subtle but still powerful racism continues. This can be institutional and structural, poor educational system, housing redlining, but also on a personal level too, microaggressions and other such phenomenon. And then from 1980 through the present, there's been, unfortunately, significant stagnation, because despite all sorts of efforts to increase Black representation in medicine, the number of Blacks entering the profession today is no more than it was 4 decades ago. And many of the problems of the experiences encountered by Black medical students and residents and physicians continue. So we've got a lot of work to do. I'd like to say a word about Abraham Flexner, who has become a much more controversial figure today than he was even a few years ago. There are many positives to Flexner. In many ways, he was not only was a champion of medical education, but a champion of African-American medical education. He stood for excellence. Anyone who's even vaguely familiar with the conditions of medical education in 1910 can't help but be impressed with how necessary those reforms were and in the public interest. We have a collective amnesia about how horrible Jim Crow was. If we're looking at 1910, we're talking about lynchings every 3 to 4 days somewhere in the United States. We're talking about 60 to 70% illiteracy in the Black population. We're talking about retaliation against whites who were friendly to Blacks. So if a white wanted to educate or teach a Black or establish a school, that white individual or his family was subject to physical attack, or lynching themselves, or the house burned down. You'll recall that Woodrow Wilson screened Birth of a Nation in the White House when it came out. It's easy to forget how horrible the conditions were. Abraham Flexner rescued Howard Meharry Medical School. He solely is responsible for their survival, because after recommending that they be supported in the Flexner report, he went out and raised the funds to allow them to reach a much higher level and stability. When he left the Carnegie Foundation, he helped build a school system for Blacks throughout the South. And in the words of Kenneth Manning, a very distinguished Black historian, Manning called Flexner, quote, "without doubt, one of the best allies a Black could find among whites at that era." Nevertheless, Flexner was far from perfect. And in my own work in the last year or so on the new project, I've come to see him in a somewhat different light. He was what some have called a paternalistic segregationist. He was quite liberal and progressive for his era, but his era was one of profound racism and hatred. And Flexner echoed stereotypes of the era, such as Blacks being disease carriers. Flexner was a rugged individualist. He himself was one of several children of a poor Jewish family in Louisville, and he and each of his siblings raised themselves up by the bootstraps to have extraordinarily successful lives. He thought that success was a matter of the individual and individual ability and determination. He didn't really recognize how opportunity also plays a role, and circumstance also plays a role in in anyone's realization of their potential. I will say that later in his life, he did become more cognizant of the power of the environment. I think most notable to today's conversation is that in the Flexner report, one finds an institutionalization of the idea of inferiority. He has a short chapter on Negroes in medical education. And in his words, Negroes are to be, quote, sanitarians. And this is what he said: the Negro needs to receive a substantial education in which hygiene rather than surgery or medicine is strongly accentuated. In other words, this idea that Blacks not only putting barriers to a Black individual entering medicine, but this notion that Blacks are incapable of becoming doctors. So we'll give them subordinate roles. And I think that this is a legacy of the Flexner report that needs to be dealt with today. I'd like to take a deeper look into some of the challenges and issues that come up if we're talking about equity and diversity in medicine. And the first point to keep in mind in any analysis is to remember that the African-American experience is not monolithic. We have to regard each individual as an individual. There are generic similarities, but there are lots of differences as well. One must be very wary about generalizing from the experience of any one individual. A second important point, and there's a typo that I just recognized. It's written diversity and inclusion. That should be a not equal sign. Diversity is not equal to inclusion. And that is a key point in understanding our current dilemma and working to make it better. The issue is not just numerical representation, but inclusion and providing opportunities and making individuals feel welcome. It's the conditions of work that matter, once again, not just the number of Blacks who are in medicine, the opportunities and the rewards that are there for Blacks who choose to have careers in medicine. If we're looking at the issue of representation in the medical profession, it becomes clear that there is much medical schools can do, but there are also limitations because admissions committee deal with the students who apply to it, and we have inadequate pipelines to medicine. And this raises issues of agency versus structural obstacles. I have read many hundreds of biographies and autobiographies, journal articles about people. I've spoken with dozens, if not scores, of African-American friends of mine and colleagues in medicine. And one cannot help but be impressed by the extraordinary capability of individuals, of Black individuals who have entered medicine. And the further one goes back in history, and the longer ago, the more impressive this is, because the great obstacles they had to overcome. Clearly, individuals matter, but at the same time, it's also clear that there are lots of structural obstacles that have to do with where one lives, school systems, and those play a role as well. If we're looking at the pipeline, the further one gets away from the medical school in the earlier life, in my view, the more powerful these structural obstacles seem to appear. Another analytic point is to recognize that the growing Black middle class is what is wonderful to have, but it's a great triumph. And those who remember the time from before the civil rights legislation are just astonished at how prominent African Americans have become in today's society and today's business and entertainment and professions. But it shouldn't delude us from recognizing that that does not signal the end of racism, and that there are still significant structural and systemic issues that all have to encounter, even those who succeed in overcoming them. Another analytical question that comes up is, how do we really measure racism or the success of an intervention to minimize racism? Some have suggested that we look at results. So if you have a profession with 2% Blacks at the time that Blacks are 12% of the population, clearly something isn't jiving. But as Professor Chambers said earlier, if you put it strictly in terms of results, is that right also? Where it raises questions where merit fits in and where assessment fits in. And I've always viewed the problems of assessment to be one of the greatest thorns in medical education. How do we really evaluate or grade or assess people or the work they do? We don't have good tools for assessment. We know what we want in our doctors, and we know what we want in the behavior of our clerks and our residents as we evaluate them, but we're really not very good at measuring them. And my view is that the person who can come up with better tools of assessment deserves a Nobel Prize in medicine, and that we can find a way in which merit and equity do coexist with each other. Some concluding observations to offer. I hope that it's clear that in talking about equity and diversity and inclusion in medicine, that we see that this is an American story, not just a medical story. I think it's also clear that we have deep work to do. Many schools will, particularly after the Floyd George murder, have done virtue signaling and come out with anti-racist statements. But there's been very little sustained effort to change the culture of the institution, to do the transformational work that is necessary if we are to be truly equitable and fair institutions. We need to address the pipeline issue, not just the behavior of medical schools and the medical profession. So we have deep-rooted structural and societal issues to contend with. Can academic medicine lead in this? We've talked in previous sessions in this series about the social contract, but our record in medicine and serving the social contract is not particularly good. We've done a magnificent job with medical knowledge and the capabilities to intervene and help the care of individuals. But we've never, as a profession, collectively come together for the public good on issues of what type of healthcare system we have and want to have and how to achieve it. Not to mention issues of equity in terms of who we want to allow into the profession. What we really need to do, in my view, is to contend with these issues of who we want to be and how do we measure ourselves. And my final observation would be that these are achievable objectives because diversity and inclusion are consistent with our core values. And when I get discouraged by the complexity of the problems, I tend to go back to that particular observation. A medical profession that wants to be all it can be and give everything it can to the public, by definition, is going to want to include as many people as possible in the entering pool, because we'll have the best people going into medicine. And that's why we're here. And as I suggested before, that I see equity and diversity being, merit and diversity being compatible with each other, in contradiction to the views of some today that say you have to choose one or the other. I don't see why you can't have both. So I think I'll stop at this point. I want to leave time for other speakers and conversation, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today. Welcome any questions or comments that might come later.
Thank you, Dr. Ludmer. You've really set the stage very nicely for us. The next speaker is Dr. Philip Capuso. He is a professor of pediatrics, molecular biology, cell biology, and biochemistry. That sort of sets the stage for defining his multi-interests and his multi-expertise. He was also the Dean Emeritus of Medical Education and the past director of the BA-MD program at Brown University. And I'm delighted that he has agreed to join with us. Most recently, he and his colleagues have had an interesting paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that really speaks to giving some of the data that Dr. Ludmer has talked to us about quantitatively. He and his colleagues have written a paper on the admissions practices of medical admissions over the past 40 years. And I found it extremely interesting and represents the challenges that we all face. So without further ado, Dr. Capuso, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll share my screen and show my slides. I have to confess that my choice for a title was influenced by Dr. Chambers' origins in the Bronx and affinity for the New York Yankees. So I'm a student of Yogi Berra as a purveyor of malapropism. So hence the title, Achieving Diversity of the U.S. Medical Student Body, Where Are We and Why Didn't We Get There? No disclosures. So in 2019, one of our students, Devin Morris, went to my colleague Ellie Adachi and said that she was interested in a research project to address a simple question: how much progress has been made in recent decades in diversifying the U.S. medical student body? And she was interested in taking a quantitative approach using whatever data were available. Ellie and I often do writing projects together, so he brought me into the project. And we went to the AAMC, and I'll jump ahead to just say that Devin's extraordinary work in pulling the data together, interpreting it, working with our other collaborators, ultimately resulted in her having a first author paper in the New England Journal that came out this past April. We started out with a discussion about why we should care about diversity, and this, I'm sorry to say, has become a somewhat controversial subject in an era where there's a great deal of opposition to the concept of quotas or even affirmative action. I find this comment from the Institute of Medicine in 2004 to be an important one. Increasing racial and ethnic diversity among health professionals is associated with improved access to care for racial and ethnic minority patients. In other words, we can best meet our mission of providing care, providing good quality health care by having a population of physicians that looks like the population we serve. Our approach was to go to the AAMC. We were fortunate to get a grant from them because they normally charge for their time and effort in producing data. And they gave to us a rich set of raw data. It was organized by school and by year. It represented the full spectrum of the diversity data that they collect. So that meant that over the course of these many years, 1978 to the present, their categories changed. And that presented a bit of a challenge in trying to analyze the data. Meant that we had to make some decisions about how we collated the data. But I will say in the final analysis, this was really straightforward. And as you'll see, this is a simple descriptive project that just required some perseverance in dealing with what was a very large and complex data set. As was already alluded to, the disparity in the admission to medical school of men and women is something that was largely resolved by 2005. And since then, there has been relative equity in the presence of men and women in medical schools. We stratified all of our race and ethnicity data by sex and immediately saw some data that were surprising, at least to me. The rather marked decline in the proportion of students represented by white men, I don't think is too shocking. That was going to be a natural consequence of diversity when the population was so skewed to start with. What surprised me a bit was that the proportion of matriculants who were represented by white women simply did not change very much over all of these years. And there was the well-documented rise in the representation of Asian men and women. And then at the bottom there, in those stars, you're just seeing data representing those who identified with more than one race or ethnic group. That's where a lot of the complexity in the data set arose. It used to be that a student filling out their forms could select one race and one ethnicity, non-Hispanic or Hispanic. And in around 2004 actually, AAMC began allowing much more latitude in how students checked off the boxes. The reason for the appearance of that multiple group preceding when students were allowed to do that is that the AAMC also updates their data. So if a student goes in and checks one set of boxes when they're entering medical school, but then they check a different set of boxes when they begin their residency, then their data changes. Looking at the groups that have long been underrepresented in medicine, this is where we saw something that is concerning, to say the least, disturbing, and I have to confess was to some small degree a surprise to me, and that was the utter lack of progress in increasing the representation of Black men, and what was at most only very modest progress in increasing the representation of Black women. You'll see that the curves for Hispanic men and women are very odd looking, and I'll get to that in a second. And then the two categories, American Indian or Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, are just vanishingly small in their representation, and that has really not changed. Relative to the principle that the population of physicians should look something like the population of patients we serve, we actually used US Census data to look at relative underrepresentation and overrepresentation. And what we found here are women. What we found was that representation of white women has been relatively low for the duration of our study period. Same was true for Black women, that persists, Hispanic women. We had some concerns about how the data would be viewed because of the relative overrepresentation of students who self-identify as Asian. Now, I have to say that that is a very mixed group, and the AAMC does collect granular data on the origins of students. So it would have been possible for us to distinguish between East Asian, I believe they collect data for Pakistani, Indian, et cetera, et cetera. And we chose not to do that because we didn't think that that really contributed to a view of the overall situation. The other thing that's apparent here, more apparent than can be seen in the raw data, is that there's a tremendous underrepresentation of American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders among women. Among men, the situation is the same. There is still a very modest overrepresentation of white men and a worsening underrepresentation of Black men, Hispanic men. So I think one can only interpret these data as showing an utter lack of success in diversifying our population of medical students. This is something I was alluding to earlier. If you looked at students who identified solely as Hispanic, there was this dip when the AAMC allowed students to check off more than one box. And if one looks at those who are identifying as Hispanic or one or more than one other race or ethnic group, then there has actually been a modest but steady increase in the proportion of both men and women who self-identify as Hispanic. We looked at the contribution of historically Black medical schools, realizing that though the number of those schools is small and their class size is relatively small, they were likely making a significant contribution to the enrollment of Black and African American men and women. And in fact, you can see that over the years, that contribution has remained about constant. My interpretation of this is that as bad as the situation appears, it's even worse if one doesn't, if one discounts the contribution of those 4 schools. And I might add there are several other schools, about 10 others, that have a much greater representation of Black and African American students than the majority of the other 140 or so medical schools in North America. In other words, a small number of schools are largely responsible for the nonetheless relatively small proportion of Black and African American students. We looked at applicants by sex and race and ethnicity. And so here I've just shown the data as women and men on the left from groups that are not underrepresented in medicine, and women and men on the right from groups that are underrepresented in medicine. And what you see is that there is very much a parallel to the relative proportions of matriculants. So there's been no increase in among Black and Hispanic applicants to medical school. We took a look at matriculation rates, and what we found was that the variance was about the same for all the groups. So the very limited diversity of the student body is not explained by differences in matriculation rates, but it is accounted for to a significant degree by differences in the applicant pool. Recently, in my discussions with Devin and with Eliadashi, I came up with the hypothesis that schools with greater resources would have greater success in achieving a more diverse student body. And I took a quick, and I will admit very flawed, preliminary look at this by using US News ranking, acknowledging that the schools that are most highly ranked by the US News report are those schools that tend to have the largest endowments. And what I found was really no evidence whatsoever that schools with greater resources were achieving greater diversity in their student bodies. Now, there are a variety of reasons that this is flawed, not the least of which is that a number of schools wind up being either unranked or they're not among the subset of schools that are ranked by US News. And I currently have a data request in with AAMC. We'll see how that goes because there are concerns about confidentiality. I would actually like to look at the diversity of individual school student bodies in relationship to the resources those schools have as measured by the size of their endowments per student, financial aid allocations. And we'll see it, but I suspect that my hypothesis, and I didn't mean to be cynical in stating that hypothesis, but I'm pretty sure the hypothesis will be disproven, that this relative lack of success is something that's pervasive and it crosses barriers related to the resources that schools have. So the question that obviously arises from this, and I had many long conversations with Devin, what should and can be done to improve the diversity of the US medical student body? So one finds an awful lot in the literature about employing a holistic admissions approach. It's been a subject of discussion for decades. It was advanced by the AAMC in a 2007 report. Many medical schools claim to have adopted a holistic admissions policy. So I think what one can conclude from our data is that simply talking about holistic admissions approach has not had any apparent benefit with regard to diversifying the student body. Now, I'll speak from my personal experience here at Brown. A critical barrier, I think, is the US News ranking. And at one point, I actually got a call from our provost, and I won't say when it was because that would identify who it was. But I got a call from our provost who bypassed the dean and said to me, we really should be doing more to improve our US News ranking. Why are we not paying more attention to MCAT scores? And my answer was, we are very focused on achieving diversity in our student body, and you have a choice. You can support us in doing that, or you can tell us that we're going to pay more attention to MCAT scores for the purpose of improving our US News ranking. And I have to admit that I was put off by even the articulation of that approach after the years that I had worked in the medical school by that point, many of them with Alicia, I'm pleased to say. And I came to conclude that how schools are viewed to a large degree based on rankings has been a significant impediment to achieving diversity. Reducing financial barriers for students from underrepresented groups may possibly be a help. But again, I look forward to obtaining data from AAMC to see whether or not that's the case. When I looked at the statements by schools that are now touting themselves as being, quote, free for some or all of their students, they all focus on making school available for the most qualified students. I didn't see any mention of achieving diversity in the statements that those schools made when they were rolling out their programs to make medical school free. Reducing the cost of applying to medical school is something we should all be advocating, although the online system has resulted in a huge increase in the total number of applications, which has been overwhelming to schools and has actually resulted in schools being more likely to use metrics such as standardized exam scores to winnow down the number of applications. Addressing real barriers is something that we ought to do when we're thinking about applicants to medical school from underrepresented groups. One of the things I looked at during my years as associate dean, which by the way were 2005 to 2013, so some of that is now getting to be somewhat old history. One of the things I looked at was the diversity of the pre-med population at Brown University. And what I found, and I never published the data and did not succeed in getting the school to really address this. What I found was that the population of pre-med students at Brown was far more diverse prior to the point that students took organic chemistry than it was afterwards. And in conversations with the pre-med advisors at Brown, what I learned was that if students doing well in organic chemistry, regardless of their other qualifications, and certainly regardless of their race and ethnicity and gender, they were being told that they were not ideally qualified for medical school. And pre-med advisors at colleges are judged based on success rates. So they become very risk averse, and they tend to advise undergraduate students to not apply to medical school if those students have concerning issues such as poor grades in some particular courses in their dossiers. We've had a BA-MD program at Brown, and I'll just correct one minor thing that Dr. Chambers said. I actually did not direct the program. The person who directed the program reported to me, and I enjoyed working with Dr. Julie Ip for all 8 years I was in the associate dean job. The BA-MD program at Brown, the program in liberal medical education, was launched not so long after the medical school was founded here. It was launched only 10 years after the first medical school class graduated. And it still accounts for almost a third of matriculants to Alpert Medical School. And students are pre-admitted to the medical school. They have minimal pre-med requirements. MCATs are not required, and there's no GPA requirement because Brown doesn't calculate GPAs. And that program has been a target of every dean who's come through the medical school for as long as I can remember, because of this concern that students who weren't qualified would come to the medical school. And it was a form of bias that was really concerning. And it was especially concerning because for all the years there's been a medical school here, the PLME has been a disproportionate contributor to the diversity of our medical school. Along with Paul George and others in the medical school, we published a paper in Academic Medicine looking at the association between pre-medical curricular admission requirements and medical school performance and residency placement, because at a point beginning in 2010 and then going forward to 2015, we had students who were admitted via the PLME and a cohort of students who were admitted through a standard pre-med route, which Brown used to not have. In those MD classes, the PLME students accounted for 55% of all the matriculants, and 88% of the PLME undergraduate matriculants entered medical school. So there was only a 12% attrition rate. The PLME cohort was more diverse by a factor of almost 2 than the other means of admission, which included also post-baccalaureate programs. And the PLME students were much less likely to major in a STEM field, only 45% versus 68% for pre-med students. And here are data on the number of science courses taken by PLME undergraduates and traditional pre-med matriculants to Alfred Medical School during those years. And you can see that the PLMEs took about half as many science courses, and many of them actually placed out of physics and math because they took advanced placement courses in high school. So did this matter? Well, remember that the PLME students did not have to take MCATs, so they were not being selected in any way based on standardized exam performance, and yet their standardized examination scores, we give exams in the first 2 years of medical school that are actually single best answer, multiple choice exams that are timed, and they're very much like standardized exams. The pre-med students scored slightly greater. The pre-med students scored slightly greater on the USMLE Step 1, shelf exams, and Step 2 CK. But when we looked at residency placement, there were no differences. And when we looked at the relationship between the number of pre-med science courses taken and these standardized exam performances, there was a weak association in first-year exams, but then the standard pre-med students were primed to start medical school. I mean, they'd been taking a lot more science courses and taking a lot more exams that were like the exams in med school. And what we found was that things pretty much evened out, such that by the time our students got to the third year and they were taking clerkship shelf exams, there was no relationship whatsoever between the number of pre-med science courses and how they performed. And that was also true for Step 2 CK. And when we looked at competitiveness of residencies, and again, this was acceptable to the journal, it was very flawed because residencies are not ranked. However, residencies may be associated with medical schools that are ranked. So, there were a variety of ways for us to look at the competitiveness of the residencies. We also looked at discipline-specific competitiveness by using the discipline-specific average USMLE Step 1 score. And what we saw was a very weak relationship between number of pre-medical science courses and the competitiveness of the residency attained by students. There were similar rates for the two groups into primary care disciplines, and there were no differences in placement into prestigious programs, again, based on US News ranking. So, my conclusions, briefly stated, the ultimate success in achieving diversity of our physician workforce will depend on elimination of disparities across the educational curriculum. This is not going to be fixed by medical schools, and it's not going to be fixed by paying more attention to the pre-med course of study in prestigious colleges. We really need to go beyond that. And I think pipeline programs that on the part of medical schools that reach back to the secondary schools in their region is one such approach. And then physicians advocating for greater equity in public education would be, I think, over the long haul, very important. And in the meantime, innovative pipeline programs and BAMD programs may represent a more practical and effective approach to achieving workforce diversity. So I look forward to questions and comments later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Capuso. You've given us lots of data to chew on. So, as I said, we will have, as part of our panel discussion, questions and answers. But I'd like to go on to our third speaker, Dr. Alicia Monroe, who serves as the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic and Faculty Affairs, Professor of Family Medicine, and Provost at the Baylor College of Medicine in Texas. Dr. Monroe was got her medical degree from the Indiana University School of Medicine, did an internship in psychiatry at Georgetown, and was a resident in family medicine at the Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis. She is the recipient of numerous teaching and mentoring awards, and her scholarly interests include physician-patient communication, cross-cultural communication, diversity and inclusion, leadership development, and mentoring and training for students and faculty. And I must say that I hadn't met her until a couple of months ago, and my talks with her have been just delightful and informative. So, Dr. Monroe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chambers, and look forward to sharing some thoughts that will hopefully synergize with comments made by Dr. Ludmeyer and also Dr. Capuso. And I really want to situate my comments into the notion of thinking about what's on the next horizon as it relates to us taking meaningful steps within academic medicine to really align diversity and excellence. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the role of structural racism on diversity in medicine, a snapshot on the potential role that holistic admissions and practices could make in advancing workforce diversity. I think Dr. Capuso's comments and certainly the longitudinal study he and his colleagues completed, I think in many ways identify where we're not. I'm going to say a few words about inclusive excellence, what it is, how you get there, and then just a bit about holistic approaches to student services. So again, diversity broadly defined is really what we're aiming for. And certainly Peter Slavin, he recently stepped down as the president of Mass General Hospital. And he had really been a longtime champion for not only diversity, but also equity and inclusion in healthcare. He established many groundbreaking programs and centers at Mass General to really operationalize equity. So clearly we're speaking about equity in thought, how people think, cognitive diversity, but also diversity as it relates to language and religion and ethnicity. Dr. Ludmeyer really spoke about intersectionality. I shouldn't have to choose. No one should have to choose about whether you see me as a woman or an African-American or someone who happens to be with children or someone who is cis. So I think as we think about all of these criteria, it's important that to conceptualize that we need to move past a box checking mentality as it relates to diversity and really move into a mindset that really embraces the aspects of diversity that cultivate and enhance intellectual ferment and intellectual creativity and problem solving. So of course, the groundbreaking work of Scott Page, he's a mathematician, and he clearly, his work elevates the importance of cognitive diversity in solving complex problems. It's very important that we understand that it's not just important to have people who look differently, but to cultivate an environment where those differences can actually be aligned and synergized and actually help us as a profession, both scientists and team science, as well as in caring for complicated patients, that we are moving past sort of old ways of thinking. So clearly, we have known for a very long time, at least some of us have known for a very long time, that there are inequities in not just health status, but in ways in which healthcare is delivered. The groundbreaking work by the Institute of Medicine, Unequal Treatment, Confronting Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Healthcare, that work was published back in 2003. So this was groundbreaking work. The research is solid, but quite frankly, very little has changed in how we educate our students, how we recruit them, and how we deliver healthcare. Certainly, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has really laid bare some of the unresolved inequities associated with health status, the disproportionate ways in which Native American communities, Hispanic, African American communities, some urban communities were disproportionately affected by COVID-19, really underscored that the work that's been done, these longstanding observations, that there needs to be a call to action. And I look forward to Dr. Wilson's comments. He will be the speaker that will follow my remarks. So certainly interventions that have been recommended include systemic strategies, certainly cross-cultural education, creating an environment where that's really patient-centered, implementing things like patient navigators to make it easier for patients to really navigate complex medical systems. Certainly research is important, but also diversifying the workforce has been touted as a strategy, because to the degree that we begin to educate individuals who come from particular communities, not because they have to go to that community, because quite frankly, if you look at the literature, the folks who provide a disproportionate amount of care to underserved populations tend to be from underrepresented groups. I do want to make a parenthetical comment that I think it is unfair to students who happen to be from underrepresented backgrounds for them to be pushed into primary care disciplines. We need well-trained, highly technical subspecialists who are from diverse backgrounds, in addition to needing physicians and other health professionals who perhaps choose to pursue disciplines related to primary care. I think it's important to acknowledge, and certainly the previous speakers have acknowledged, that structural racism is real, but it translates into a legacy of exclusion in higher ed, because most communities fund public schools based on tax dollars. So if one grows up in a low-income neighborhood and has poorly resourced schools, they're much less likely to have access to gifted programs, and when they get to high school, to AP programs. So some of the readiness that frankly prepares individuals for medical school is frankly not available. So although talent is equally distributed, opportunity is not. We have an opportunity gap in the United States. And the question is, are we really motivated to do anything about it? So again, this is a snapshot. Dr. Capuso did a great job providing the longitudinal snapshot. I thought you might be interested in seeing what the enrollment for 2021 really looks like. You can really look at the African American, the American Indian and Alaska Native numbers, been pretty flat for a long time. Native Hawaiians, very flat, 28, 29, up to 40. You can look at the number of Asian students of the proportion have remained pretty strong. White students, that's remained pretty stable. So as you can see, most of the proportions over time, although the overall number may, totals may wax and wane, you can see that there's not a whole lot of movement. So let's talk a little bit about structural factors. Let's face it, in medicine and science, we have an unconscious, many of us, a survival of the fittest mentality. We believe in merit and we believe in the meritocracy, but we are willing easily to turn a blind eye on this notion of what the metrics of merit as it relates to standardized test scores, as it relates to GPAs, are often undergirded by lives of privilege. They're often undergirded by the opportunities of students to take prep courses, to live in neighborhoods where they have access to highly enriched environments. And frankly, many of the students have had mentors that allowed them and supported them in grappling with complicated scientific material. So by the time they arrive at undergraduate school, they have a level of academic readiness that quite frankly may exceed that that's commonly present in other students. These root causes of inequity, these structural factors, if you will, are very much embedded, and they are ensconced, and they're invisible. They very much have to do with political systems, who gets incarcerated, if you get pulled over, often depending on what you look like, depends upon whether you get a warning or whether you get reprimanded and arrested. Whether you, depending on what Dr. Ludmeyer mentioned, redlining. Redlining was very common. There are legalized discrimination that have made it difficult, and these structural factors have cumulatively added to limiting opportunities for some of our young people who are aspiring physicians. So we are squandering some of our talent based upon the lack of equity and opportunity. So a bit more on structural racism. So it's really it's the totality of all the systems, the policies, the procedures. There are frankly some pretty sad data, but there's a lot of studies that indicates that if you have an ethnic name or you happen to be a woman, if you have an equal qualifications as documented on a resume, there have been studies done. All you have to do is change the sex of the person or the name, and it will have a significant impact on whether the individual gets a call back from a recruiter. This is real. Structural racism and unconscious bias limits opportunity today for many women and for many individuals who may have names that are perceived to be ethnic. Those names that people say they can't pronounce, that are too long, that are frankly, many of them are phonetic. If you just sort of tried, you could. But I think the racialized discrimination and the whether it's based on religion or other forms of bias or frankly just ignorance, does close doors for many. So this recent work, and I strongly recommend this, and this was a paper published by Catherine Lucy and Aaron Segal, and it really talks about past its prologue, that structural racism significantly contributes to the performance of underrepresented groups on MCAT scores. They also have a podcast that I would highly recommend, because in both the podcast and the article, what they do is they underscore three key points that I'd like to share with you. One is that the MCAT is not an aptitude test, it is an achievement test. It demonstrates readiness to complete an MD curriculum. There is clearly good data done by the MCAT validity community that looks at the range of MCAT scores that are associated with success in medical school. There's also data that there are many schools who do take students who have a different range of MCAT scores, and they tend to have similar rates of graduation. And a word about a US News and World Report. They look at median scores, not mean scores. So if your curve skews to the high, that doesn't mean that you can't accept a range of MCAT scores of students that are likely to achieve at your institution, perform well, and more importantly, they have other characteristics that will make them ideal for in the practice of medicine. So again, holistic review, what is it? A lot of institutions say they've adopted it, but they only use a holistic approach after they've screened out 30%, 40%, 50% of their applicants based on GPA and MCAT scores. There are very few institutions who use a range of scores and then present their committees with all of those students and blind those committees to the MCAT score. For those institutions who do it that way, they find that they admit a more diverse class. And when they've followed those classes for success over time, those students have done well. So there is a holistic set of principles and a process, but based on some work that we've done with some colleagues, there are different ways in which the holistic principles are applied to the admissions process. And Dr. Lucy makes some very interesting comments in her podcast, and she indicates that often admissions committee members are individuals that have been on the faculty for a very long time. And many of them have been on the faculty and on the admissions committee during the season where most of the students that they admitted were white men, and they used the MCATs in a particular way, and they continue to want to use the MCATs in the same way, even though their mission may have evolved or their student body or their student applicant pool may have become more diverse. What I can tell you, and this is anecdotal information, at our institution, when I arrived 8 years ago and I inquired, are you using holistic admissions? The response was, yes, we are. However, when they actually, when the dean elected to have the AAMC come and do a workshop on holistic admissions, and they really learned about what a holistic process was and began to implement that, Baylor has admitted 2 of the most diverse classes they've admitted in a very long time. So, and again, our metrics are about the same. Our GPAs are the same and our MCAT mean scores are the same. So I would postulate that I don't believe that holistic review has had the opportunity to move the needle. And my hypothesis is it's not truly a holistic process from start to finish. So let's talk a little bit about, so what is holistic admissions all about? First of all, it does take a whole applicant approach. And there are both strategies that are associated with enrollment and also academic and student affairs. In other words, when you're thinking about holistic admissions, you're thinking about the students' experiences, their attributes, as well as their metrics. And all of those variables are balanced without an excessive amount of weight, if you will, being placed on one or more. So the institutions that really implement fully the holistic processes and principles really implement it throughout the process. And they find that they're able to matriculate students that better align with their mission. The students have strong academics. They tend to perform well, but they also are able to admit a class that frankly cultivates an environment where the students have a higher degree of readiness to care for a diverse population. In fact, what we're finding at our institution, I don't know what you're finding at yours, is that our prospective applicants are concerned about and asking about, we want to make sure that there's more diversity. What are the kinds of things that we're doing in our institution to optimize our ability to attract and matriculate qualified applicants from diverse backgrounds? So again, it's important at the end of the day, our goals are better patient care, reducing healthcare disparities. We want to make sure that we have a critical mass of students and that we are creating an educational atmosphere where we leverage the power of those diverse points of view. So again, this is the EAM model. I thought it might be helpful to visualize it, but it helps us to the concept of widening the lens through which we're looking at applicants, evaluating them, and assessing excellence. So when we begin to think about how to align diversity and excellence, the holistic principles and processes are a strategy that institutions can consider. It allows them to really look creatively at their pool, and it's also suggested that institutions look retrospectively rather than using anecdotal data. What are the ranges of MCAT scores, if you have them, that are associated with students being successful? But more importantly, what were the other attributes that align with the institutional mission and also better prepare those individuals to be caring, empathetic, high quality professionals. So again, diversity alone is not enough. So it's not just important to have diversity. So diversity is not alone is not enough. We really need inclusion. So yes, diversity is important for innovation and creativity and complex problem solving, but to fully actualize all the benefits, diversity and inclusion must be inextricably linked. Okay, the next generation of work that we're going to talk about is how we change our mindsets, update them. We really shape our behavior and our culture and focus on institutional climate, focus on bias, and frankly, structural factors in our educational programs, in our admissions processes, and how we deliver services and provide clinical education that really reflects inclusive excellence and equity mindedness. Who's at the table when decisions are made? Whose voices are heard? And isn't there an environment where it is safe for students who are not at the high up on the power hierarchy to actually speak? So some work I'd also like to draw your attention to is this there's a set of 3 papers that were commissioned and partially supported by the Ford Foundation. And this was work that was actually organized and administered through the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And this is, I think, some really groundbreaking work, and for institutions that are very interested in a research-based perspective on how to make diversity work on a campus, because we talk about constituent diversity and we talk about inclusion, but we don't necessarily have the infrastructure in place to really facilitate that optimization of that inclusion. So this particular work, this paper, really encourages higher ed institutions to conceptualize diversity as a process toward better learning and better learning outcome, but not an outcome in and of itself. It is not to fill in a table with race and gender and check some boxes. Rather, it becomes a vehicle or a process toward really developing an environment where you have a rich exchange of ideas. And that work really encourages us to enact diversity in ways that enhances students' intercultural competency, really prepares students to have conversations across areas of difference, and also cultivates a capacity for them to work in diverse groups, for them to be actively engaged as scientists in team science, actively engaged in clinical environments in team-based care, and to really leverage the empirical evidence that frankly already exists to really how we design and enhance our learning environments. So I think we got to update our mindset and our approaches as it relates to how we design our learning environments. So I'm just going to pause there, and I'm going to, this is an opportunity for all, I don't know if participants have access to the chat or not. They may not. Oh, they do. So I encourage everybody, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you think about inclusive excellence? And please just write your word in the chat. This is to break up the monotony of hearing people drone on. I don't see, okay, collaboration, great, unbiased consideration, fantastic, wisdom, institutional support, acceptance, success. Thank you. Justice, great. Thank you very much. Equality, justice, thank you. So it really supports students' intellectual and their social and professional development. It actually fosters and cultivates an environment that both develops and utilizes organizational resources to both challenge students, but also enable them to achieve at a high level and contribute to the knowledge of peers. One of the pipeline ideas that has bubbled up in our conversation, one of the things that I'm just most excited about is that Baylor has actually relationships with 4 middle schools. And those middle schools, at least 2 of them have been failing schools in the Houston areas. 2 of them were closed and they were reopened. And they were opened in collaboration with Baylor College of Medicine. And what Baylor provides is support for the teachers, a science curriculum, and within that school, students don't have to test in. They can come from all their parents, just have to sign them up and put them on a list. So they're able to enter this middle school. It's one of the 2 of our 4 schools have been identified as one of the most COVID resistant from the standpoint of student achievement over the last year. So what's the secret sauce? First of all, there's commitment. Secondly, the teachers believe the students can succeed. Students are provided supplemental instruction during their lunch hours or during study halls. No, they're able to eat during their study breaks, study halls, so that the teachers work with the students to close the performance gap. So students are not just performing at grade level, they're performing above grade level. So there is movement in student math and science scores in middle school. My point is, if we cultivate an environment that develops and utilizes the resources that challenge and enable students that have experienced opportunity gaps in education, we can begin to close those gaps. But we can't think in customary old ways of you're either well-made, you've had opportunities, or you haven't. But we have to create opportunities for students to actually succeed. I think we have to attend to cultural differences and particularly create a safe space where the students can bring those cultural differences to the environment and add intellectual vitality to the learning environment. And it really will help to foster that welcoming, that community that really engages the students in a way that, quite frankly, they are also, their expertise and their perspectives are valued. So again, the benefits, it embraces it. We practice conscious inclusion, again, who's around the table, and we cultivate equity mindedness, and we communicate in a way that we allow ourselves, we acknowledge that we're not always going to get it right. And if we're going to have conversations across difference, we have to have an environment where when things don't go well, or when things are said that are offensive, that we can have civil conversations and work it through. And we have a long way to go in academic medicine, in education in general, and certainly in society. But I think that's a worthy goal. So my last slide and the last point I'd like to make is really this whole notion of integrated and holistic student services. Let's face it, there is a hidden curriculum in medicine. There is a hidden curriculum. But if you've had a dad who's a doctor, or you grew up in medicine, or you have parents in higher education, then you understand a bit about the hidden curriculum and the culture. So you know how to navigate that environment. And even if you have to ask for a question, ask questions or ask for help, you know who to go to. One of the things that a lot of students from under-resourced educational environments experience, and that's stereotype threat. They perceive that they're being judged negatively based on what they look like. So between stereotype threat that can actually elevate anxiety and move students on the performance curve from coping and performing well to not performing well, it can have a dramatic impact. There is a significant work in the literature on stereotype threat. If every faculty member teaching in a medical school or in a BSMD program isn't familiar with that work, I encourage you to read it, because it's important that we understand that some of our students have had a longer distance travel than others. And if our goal is for them to be successful, how can we educate and prepare our advisors and our mentors and provide our services in a way that it allows students to know that if we admitted them, we believe they can be successful. And if we believe they can be successful, we want to remove any hidden barriers that might cause them to stumble. So there are academic medical centers. Certainly Mount Sinai is one of them that's actually developing and have implemented an integrated holistic student affairs model in their medical school. And this work is ongoing, and it actually helps to make sure that we not only use holistic processes to admit qualified, talented, excellent students that we believe can succeed, but we're intentional when we onboard them to make sure that our student services are provided in a way that there are no hidden barriers and no landmines. So I'll close with this quote by James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Monroe. You've given us lots to chew upon, and we'll get to the questions and answers and the panel after our next speaker. There's a lot to discuss, and once again, thank you. When the Royal Society was founded, Isaac Newton was its first president. And in the first address he gave to the Royal Society, which is the longest continuing scientific society in the world, Isaac Newton said, on the shoulders of giants. And as I was listening to everybody, or to our three speakers, I found that I'm listening to giants whose shoulders others will walk upon. And the last giant is our fourth speaker, Dr. Donald Wilson, who is the Dean Emeritus of the University of Maryland Medical School.
No.
I encountered him when I first came to the University of Illinois Medical School in 1979, when he was head of our gastroenterology unit. And by the way, was at that time, and I haven't done my research to find if it's still true, he was the youngest full professor of medicine that had been appointed by the University of Illinois at that time. Shortly thereafter, unfortunately for us, he left to become chairman of medicine at SUNY Downstate. And ironically, in 1991, he was recruited to be dean of the University of Maryland School of Medicine by the first chancellor of the University of Illinois at Chicago, Don Langenberg. And as I've said to the group before the symposium started, Don Langenberg and I were personal friends, and Don viewed as one of his singular accomplishments the recruiting of Don Wilson to the University of Maryland. Don was the first African-American dean of an accredited non-minority medical school in the United States. And really of interest is that during his tenure at Maryland, the minority student enrollment increased, the minority faculty nearly quadrupled, and external funding quadrupled. In fact, when Dr. Wilson was recruited, the University of Maryland was in the 5th quintile for funding. When he retired, it was in the 1st quintile. So Dr. Wilson was really a transformative dean, and one that we really can admire. Dr. Wilson has served on a variety of national advisory committees. He's the past chairman of the AAMC and the AAMC Council of Deans. And he served as the vice president of the Medical Honorary Society, AOA, And his CV or bio sketch is available online to read. If I continue to describe this, we will use up all of his time. And that I certainly don't want to do. So, Dr. Wilson, the floor is yours.
Dr. Chambers, thank you. Thank you very much. What I could do, based on the 3 previous presentations, is to say, I agree with everything everybody said. Why don't we go out and before we miss happy hour? But there's still a little time left, so I won't do that. Now, I hope that at the end of my presentation, that most folks will agree that the fairly provocative title that I've selected, in fact, does fit with the theme of our meeting. When I was 9 years old, I decided to become a doctor. It's a familiar story. I got sick. A doctor came to the house. That's not familiar now, but a doctor came to a house, gave me an injection, and I got better. Now, that physician was the only one of color in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he was already well along in age. Nevertheless, my pathway to becoming a physician was not an easy one. In Worcester, Massachusetts, when I was growing up, there were 2 schools called prep schools. They're equivalent to what junior high schools have been called in other cities. These schools were for gifted children. Now, technically, I was gifted. However, even though all of my grades were A in everything except penmanship, the principal of my school did his best to try to convince my parents not to send me to the prep schools, which were to prepare people to go to college, but instead to send me to the boys' vocational school so that I would be assured of getting a job and making a living later on. So his cultured brain told him that would be fine for somebody of my color. While he probably was not a racist, he clearly had engaged in structural racism. In 2000, approximately 10% of the 700,000 plus physicians in the United States were professionally underrepresented minorities. 19 years later, that number had increased by a tremendous amount of 1%. And at that time, underrepresented minorities made up about 1/3 of the nation's population. Related health professions, other related health professions had the same problem with racial ethnic deficiencies. So even though we are a nation and have more than 900,000 practicing physicians and spend more money per capita for healthcare than any other nation, we're not close to providing exemplary healthcare to our citizens. Glaring disparities in health, not related to genetically determined physiological responses, continue to exist between the white population and most racial ethnic minorities in our country. Some of our health statistics resemble those observed in third world countries that have little or no industry. Now, as a 9-year-old who wanted to be a doctor, I knew nothing about life expectancy, morbidity, or disparities in the quality or quantity of healthcare. All I knew was I wanted to help people be well. A Martin Luther King quote that is usually misquoted is, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death." Apropos of this meeting, this statement was recorded at a press conference in Chicago on the afternoon of March 25th, 1966. 16 years ago, the AAMC, based upon the nation's overall population growth, and particularly the growth of those over 65 years old, and the growth of our physician population's supply, projected we would have a significant shortage of physicians. After allowing for increased medical school class sizes, improved physician productivity, and other professional activity, they projected a deficiency of nearly 160,000 full-time physician equivalents in our country by 2030. Now, COVID-19 has reduced the population growth, particularly in those over the age of 65, but it's also dramatically increased the need for more physicians. So this projection is probably pretty much on target. Notwithstanding the impact of social determinants, such as housing, education, and unemployment to health disparities, the shortage of physicians is obviously a major factor. Now, we've already heard that from 1950 until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the percent of underrepresented students entering our medical schools was flat and around 2%. That was compared to a general population of about 15% in the nation. Underrepresented minority students increased to about 8% within 10 years, and then leveled off at about 10 or 11% in 2005. 15 years later, underrepresented minorities are about 13% of entering medical students and about a third of the general population. Over a decade ago, the AAMC concluded that medical schools would not be able to admit significantly more minority students using the then main current criteria, the college GPA and the MCAT score. Now, modification of the admission formula was already being used by a number of medical schools, and discussion of this concept increased. We've already heard that paying attention to other characteristics, what makes a good physician, as well as the obvious need for more underrepresented minority physicians in our nation, began to be much more widely discussed. GPA and MCAT could predict passing exams, but becoming a good physician was more complex. However, there was immediate legal concerns, as well as concerns about the quality of the academic product, that being the students who would be admitted under a new paradigm. In 1986, 6 African-American physicians in academic medicine who saw one another at educational meetings once a year, clinical meetings, research meetings, decided it was time to see if they could do more than just continue to bemoan the fact that academic medicine was basically a white male institution. They founded the Association for Academic Minority Physicians, an organization that's held 35 annual scientific meetings, received NIH grant support, awarded summer research fellowships, provided research support to junior faculty, and mentored both students and faculty. So why do we put academic in the name? Well, academic medicine is the broad consortium of institutions that together educate, train, conduct research, provide health care, and help develop health policy. Academic medicine plays the major role in some of these activities and a significant role in all. Its ability to enhance healthcare far outstrips its size. At the time, it was apparent to us that academic medicine was the only game in town that could have a meaningful impact if they wished. However, academic medicine per se is not the brass ring, nor is it the grand prize. Academic medicine is the primary tool that allows us to grasp that brass ring, the assurance that our health-related and biomedical research professionals will be appropriately trained to ultimately be capable of providing the best health care and defining research to our nation. In 1986, underrepresented minorities made up about 4% of 58 full-time academic faculty. Excluding historically Black or Puerto Rican schools, there were no medical school deans, department chairs were few and far between, and there were few full professors. When I became dean at the University of Maryland in 1991, Maryland, the oldest public medical school in the nation, was already 184 years old. Nancy Gary, as an underrepresented gender in medicine, preceded me by a year. She later went on to also become dean at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. So in 2006, there were now 9 women who were deans, but I was still alone. At the present time, women hold about 20% of the permanent dean positions in our medical schools, and about 10% are held by people who are underrepresented minorities. Just over 9% of 176,000 faculty were underrepresented minorities in 2018, compared to 4% in 1986, with the major increase being in clinician educators. Now, academic medicine cannot achieve its potential impact without diversity. It appears that a significant number of underrepresented minority students are not even applying to medical school. The most common undergraduate major for African Americans applying to medical school has been biology. Looking at AAMC data during 3 time periods indicates that while biology graduates from selected institutions more than doubled, medical school applicants increased by only 10%. Nearly all of these graduates applied to medical school in 1993, while less than half did in 2003. And the number of African American males applying to medical school is basically the same as it was 20 years ago. Now, why the diminished interest in medical school and therefore in academic medicine? Well, medical school is expensive. It's just not affordable for many minorities. Many underrepresented minority students do not feel welcome or supported in our institutions. They see few people who look like them in positions of authority. And a major complaint that I hear is the lack of mentoring. Cirali and colleagues reported Academic Medicine last month that underrepresented faculty and women are promoted less rapidly than white men and Asians in our medical schools. Now, this difference disappeared with women who are being promoted from the associate professor level, but continued for underrepresented minority faculty. It also disappeared at the associate professor level for faculty in the basic science departments. However, the clinician educator has increasingly taken on a major role of educating medical students. Now, certainly existing standards such as quality of performance, research funding, etc., must be met to warrant promotion. But given the paucity of underrepresented faculty promotion, it's difficult to speculate on why it is that there's so few people wanting to go to our medical schools. It's worth mentioning the Ginter report that was published in Science a decade ago, that was sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, which compared R01 funding success for faculty based upon their ethnicity. Now, these faculty were matched for training background, experience, and institutions, and yet African Americans were significantly less likely to be funded 16% compared to their white counterparts at 29%. Asian investigators also had a disparity with a significantly lower rate of funding, but at 25%. So the students won't come, the faculty won't stay, and those that stay do not achieve the same success internally or externally. However, according to Gibbs in 2016, the underrepresented minority talent pool does exist, at least for the basic science departments. Between 1980 and 2017, there was a 10-fold increase in underrepresented minority PhDs in fields relevant to the NIH. However, there was less than a 3-fold increase in hiring these PhDs at our medical school's basic science departments. A similar discrepancy was seen for women, although the gap was not nearly so pronounced. The production faculty hiring gap for men was very small. So how do we solve this apparent problem? Of course, we can solve it if we want to. It's time to talk a little bit more about structural racism that you just heard about. Structural racism can be defined as a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequality. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. It's important to understand that just reacting to an individual or personal issue will never solve this problem. It is also critical to get beyond the acknowledgement of structural racism and move aggressively to develop anti-racism program. The Pulitzer Prize winning author, Isabel Wilkerson, who spoke at the AAMC's annual meeting last week, likens the United States struggle with race to a family that inherited a pre-existing medical condition, which it must either confront or risk catastrophic illness. She said that Americans live today with the consequences of a racial caste system that was built hundreds of years ago and continues to harm all of its citizens and even the health of the nation. Wilkerson described a system that defines one place in society according to factors such as skin color. The system limited and continues to limit what people from the lowest caste were able to do and what benefits, such as education, they were entitled to. This hierarchy continues to foment conflict among the caste levels, as some people believe that the gain of one group comes at the expense of the other. And this ignites stress responses that harm physical and mental health of all races. She says caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. And this reminds me a little bit about Huxley's Brave New World. If you weren't born an alpha or a beta in that world, too bad for you. In fact, if you were below those levels, you wouldn't have been born, you were just created. As our nation becomes more embroiled in dialogues about critical race therapy, which most folks don't understand, and structural racism, which many believe doesn't exist, there's increasing pushback, and rightly so, by some who say, hey, I'm not responsible for what happened 200 years ago. I don't support those ideas. Give me a break. Wilkerson used the following metaphor in response to that. We as Americans are like people who inherited a house. It's very old. It has many stress fractures in pillars and joints and beams. We did not build this house, and we've come into possession of it. We've come into possession of a responsibility to repair it, whatever it takes. We are responsible. It is her opinion that racism is built into the structure of every American system, such as health, education, and criminal justice, in ways that hurt Black people today, but many others do not see. Now, one definition of institutional racism from the United Kingdom's Lawrence Report in 1999 is the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin, and can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior that amount to discrimination through prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. So what do we do now to best achieve our missions in which diversity and equity are so critical? The NIH has launched one of the most impressive approaches that I've seen to date to actually root out and destroy institutional racism. Dr. Marie Bernard, NIH Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, was the keynote speaker at the annual meeting of the Association for Academic Minority Physicians last month, and briefly outlined the steps NIH has already taken and will take. Her presentation was Systemic Racism, Curable by Vaccine, ? The NIH approach. If you suspect there was any possible collusion between us regarding our presentation titles, you're correct. Last year, NIH announced the Unite Initiative, and I will point out their goals and a few of their objectives. They wanted to ensure that biomedical research and supporting administrative system is devoid of hostility, grounded in race, sex, and other federally protected characteristics. They commit to delineate elements that may perpetuate structural racism in biomedical research within NIH and the extramural community, leading to a lack of personal inclusiveness, equity, and diversity. All ideas must be given equal and fair review without regard to current dogma, precedents, or who presents the ideas. Health disparities and inequities continue to contribute to morbidity and mortality in our nation, making it essential to redress the fundamental causes of these disparities, inequities, and identify research programs that could identify effective interventions. Now, the NIH has publicly committed to identifying and correcting any NIH policy or policies or practices that have helped to perpetuate structural racism. They have committed to aggressively implement approaches to address the Ginther gap that I mentioned earlier. They've implemented policy changes that promote anti-racism and remove barriers to professional growth for staff from diverse backgrounds, including underrepresented groups. One of the awards already issued is the first award, and I'll tell you just a little bit about that. The goal of the first award is to create cultures of inclusive excellence, establishing and maintaining scientific environments that can cultivate and benefit a full range of talent at NIH-funded institutions. A faculty cohort modeling for hiring, multi-level mentoring, and professional development is one of the goals. Integrated institution-wide systems to address bias, faculty equity, mentoring, and work-life issues. Coordination and Evaluation Center to conduct independent program evaluation of impact at the faculty and institutional level. Departmental and institutional political culture change, and establish initiative-wide metrics of faculty success, recruitment, and professional development at the pre-tenure career stages. While academic medicine is not the NIH, each component can commit to developing its own process to end structural racism. You'll have to be actual listening to folks, upgrade mentoring, and some form of financial support will be required. It will require real effort to lose the old historical and cultural brain and replace that information with relevant currency into the new brain. Martin Luther King Jr. was a brilliant man. He's had a major impact on our nation, making history here and around the world. Colin Powell was not brilliant. In fact, his grades probably would have never gotten him into medical school. But his words are prescient. We have to start thinking of America as a family. We have a unique window of opportunity to fix our old house right now. If we pass it up, this opportunity may never occur again. Remember, great minds think differently. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I am impressed that although the four speakers did not prepare their presentations in concert with one another, much of what everybody said reinforces one another. And I, at the beginning, in our pre-symposium discussion, suggested that perhaps one of the major problems that we have is the inability to really accept and work with and towards the axioms that are inherent in the social contract and in social justice and in the statements made in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths as being inalienable, that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights. Amongst them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think each of us have said in one way or another that there is a real problem with this dictate, and the problem is difficult to solve. With that, I am going to ask Dr. Meena Rao, who has spent her life doing basic medical science as a physiologist, and also doing meaningful university administration as our former vice president for academic affairs at the University of Illinois at the systems level. So vice president for academic affairs of all of our three campuses, and who has spent a considerable amount of time considering the area of diversity and achieving it. I will ask Dr. Rao to moderate this discussion, and therefore, Mina, I give the podium to you, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Don. And I just want to take 1 minute to thank the speakers for your very prescient talks. I've taken about 10 pages of notes here, but in the interest of time and in the interest of our audience, I thought how we could start this discussion is by addressing some of the questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to kind of take it in reverse order of the speakers, if I may. And Dr. Harold von Bos, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, poses a question, and I'm going to ask Dr. Wilson to address this. For those of us who are further down the medical training chain, how can we influence change? I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon who works at a smaller hospital where multiple residency programs send us residents. I'm unsure how I can influence diversity earlier in the process, and hope the panel can provide recommendations.
Well, it seems to me that anyone who has contact with trainees or students, or even just patients, has an opportunity to make change. Some years ago, I was visiting a campus that had multiple units, multiple medical schools. And I happened to be meeting with the director of orthopedics, as it turns out. And I asked him, I said, how do you sort of decide on who you select? And his response was, well, I just look for people who look like me, and we try to bring them on board. Once he said it, he was embarrassed and knew he had said something wrong. And I didn't have to say, so you look for white people who are short? The reality is that by making yourself available, by making your surroundings welcoming to students of color and to women as they come through it, it's a big, big step. When I became dean at Maryland, I never told a department chair or anybody else to go out and recruit minorities. I never told my dean of admissions to recruit more minorities. So it turns out a lot of students, underrepresented students, when they found out the dean of the medical school was Black, that was a turn on to them, because they said, it's gotta be more welcoming than what it was before. And I think this is by action and by having more people there to help you. This is how it's going to end up. This is how you're going to improve it. So I think everybody can play a role. It can't be done by one person now.
It's a lot of little steps that accumulate together.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The next question I'm going to pose is to Dr. Monroe from Dr. Tim Bilash, who says, is there value in admitting students to medical school who fail? Couldn't they bring diversity going into other parts of the community to help bridge the difficult medical ideas? We didn't negatively brand them so harshly, finding constructive off-ramps for them. Anyone who experienced first-year medical school has an experience few others have. Is there value in randomizing admissions from the larger acceptable group rather than creating somewhat arbitrary criteria? Dr. Monroe.
Thank you. That was a very complex question, very thoughtful question. So thank you. So of course, there is absolutely no value in admitting a student if you perceive in advance that he or she is going to fail. I would imagine that because we operate admissions with integrity, we would only admit students that we perceive can be successful. The question is, do we admit them to an environment that actually will support their success? Because if the student's unsuccessful experience in medical school is viewed as a failure of the student alone, I think that's short-sighted. I think if a student fails, that the medical school, but not just the admissions committee, let's not put it all on the admissions committee. I think the admissions committee should be very clear about admitting students that they perceive A, are qualified, B, can add to the intellectual environment of the institution, and C, have the capacity and have demonstrated the achievement that allows them to be successful. So a mindset that why admit a student who's going to fail? Why would you admit it? I'm imagining we don't admit any students that we know are going to fail. That's number one. And I'm imagining that there is a benevolent theme in there somewhere that suggests that we want to make sure that individuals can be connected with professions where they can be successful. Well, of course we do. But I think those things may be true, and unrelated.
Thank you. And I just want to add that, I think very often, for example, when I interview students, they ask this question about, they think it's sink or swim, right? And you have to convince students that their successes are our successes. It's like you convince junior faculty. Institutions invest a lot in recruiting medical students. We invest a lot in recruiting graduate students and recruiting junior faculty. We'd be shooting ourselves in the foot if it's going to be, may the best person win and we're going to let you sink or swim, right? It behooves us to make sure that they succeed and to make sure that those programs are very available. And I agree with you, it cannot be only the admissions office. Okay, with that, I want to turn to another question from Dr. Bilash, now to Dr. Capuso, who wanted to know, he wants to know, do we do enough to identify economic inequity as contributing to poor advances in diversity? Are poor minorities different from poor non-minorities? What is the role of parental role models?
One thought I have on the subject that doesn't directly address that question is that the wealth gap in the US is a huge issue for people entering medical school. So being able to absorb $100,000 or $200,000 in debt is something that varies tremendously among students based on historical disparities in wealth. I just have a feeling that if we were to make medical school truly free for everybody, without addressing all of the other issues that the other speakers talked about, especially Alicia's comments regarding the environment in medical school, I don't think much would change. Attrition rates are higher among students from traditionally underrepresented groups. And I don't think that that's an issue that relates to finances. Students being subjected to microaggressions in medical school just creates terrible problems. Granted, we haven't done much to address financial issues, but I don't think that they're at the core of what we're dealing with here.
No, I think it's the whole issue is just very complex and it's multi-layered, and not any one solution is going to address the problem.
What really struck me was the number of 3 to 4% of of African Americans or Latinx students applying. In order to achieve diversity, you've got to have a much higher number than that. And the question is, this isn't being accepted, this is applicants. How do we achieve that? And is it really possible? What's the time dimension that could be possible in?
And I think in the interest of getting all of our panelists involved in the discussion, if it's okay, I'd like to ask Dr. Ludmira to address that question.
It's a long-term process because the person's potential is affected from the point of conception and nutrition in the womb everything that happens after birth. So it's not, in my view, not something that's going to change overnight. The further away from the medical school one goes, the more difficult these issues are, but that's no excuse for not trying. I think that success begets success, and it's easy in this situation to be gloomy and look at all the obstacles, but I think that members of this panel can recall a time before civil rights legislation and the extraordinary limitations on all racial minorities in the Jim Crow era and the early civil rights era, and where we've come from them is phenomenal. And a lot of it has to do with a virtuous cycle of increasing confidence. You have Dr. Wilson, the first African-American dean. Students want to go to Maryland, and you can get into a positive virtuous cycle. So I think that there are a lot of, and we're becoming a more diverse society too, and that's going to I think ultimately have some very beneficial consequences if you believe race social psychologists like Gordon Allport. So I think that a lot can be done, but it's hard work. It's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you. In the interest of trying to get as many participants to ask questions, there's another question from Andrew Gonzalez. Dr. Capuso presented data suggesting that there is at best a weak correlation between undergrad science courses, MCAT, and matching to competitive residencies. Is there any similar evidence looking at outcomes for independently funded physician scientists with their NIH or HHMI or MacArthur Genius Awards? If we look at other sectors, for example, tech, there seems to be a disproportionately large number of people who are successful who did not do particularly well or even finish highly competitive programs. Example, Jobs, Musk, Gates, Brin, and Page. Dr. Capuso, would you mind taking that question, please?
Well, I think it's a question that warrants real data and facts, and I don't have those. So it's an interesting research question to pose. And I imagine that the NIH has the kind of data that would allow one to answer it, but I don't know the answer to that. What I will say, I'm a career physician scientist, and I've been involved. I've been NIH funded my whole career and involved in the NIH review process. And what I will say is that academic pedigree, I hope that term is okay, seems to matter. I mean, when you see people rise to the heights, it looks like they disproportionately come from outstanding institutions. So I think the support that they get at those institutions helps them succeed. And you know, where you start out in terms of college seems to matter. And if you go to a medical scientist training program at an outstanding institution, your chances of being NIH funded and being a highly productive physician scientists seem to be much greater. You know, I don't want to sidetrack this, but there is an elephant in the room that none of us addressed, and that's disparities in standardized examination performance. I know my experience at Brown was that we had to put considerable effort into trying to achieve equity in standardized exam performance that paralleled the equity in performance in medical school that we generally saw. The standardized exam performance among students from traditionally underrepresented groups was a persistent problem that we tried to address with advising. And because of the emphasis that graduate med ed programs place on the USMLE exams, it was the main determinant of students from underrepresented groups going into primary care disciplines. And I just wonder if the other panelists have any thought about how to address that those disparities in standardized examination scores.
Yeah, and interestingly, there is an anonymous attendee poses that a similar question, but at the level of the how does the use of SAT, ACT, and AP scores to determine college preparedness and encourage structural racism? If students are unwilling to pursue medicine in the first place because high school systems convince them that they will fail, then it'll be difficult to encourage diversity. So it's the earlier version of that, right? And what do we do to get students prepared for standardized exams? And then how do we interpret those? So that question is open for any of the panelists to address.
Well, I won't address particularly standardized exams, but I just like to say that we have to stop looking at things that we can measure, just looking at things that we're used to measuring. And we have to develop another look at what really counts in the end. And I spent frustrating years sitting on NIH councils and study sections, watching, from my perspective, grants that were just as good or better coming from an institution that was not considered such a great place, and people not wanting to support that, but supporting one from another place. And even then I was outspoken. But I think we have a tendency to keep falling back on things that we're able to measure, as opposed to saying, what should we be doing? And I feel very strongly now that we need to stop looking at what is not working. And we don't even know all of our biases. I don't know how important, I do know this. You don't need to be AOA to become an orthopedic surgeon. And yet, for some reason, orthopedists, not only do they want you to be AOA, the people who run the training programs, they want you to have written papers already. Well, that's got nothing to do with being an orthopedic surgeon. It has to do with ego, because a few years ago, it was ophthalmology, and then it's dermatology. And so as more people want to have a specialty as their own, the competition gets for it, people become more restrictive, demanding things that may have nothing to do with how they're going to be spending their life once they complete the training. And I think we need to get beyond that.
I'm going to go through an anonymous attendee. I don't know whether this is the same anonymous attendee, but ask the questions: because pediatricians play such a large part of the parent and child experience throughout early childhood, primary, middle school, and high school years of every student, especially given the student-school medical relationship, has any holistic and strategic vision to begin to recruit and survey parents whose children are interested in the biological sciences and identify them within their urban and diverse environments to support and ignite, as well as foster that interest? So the question basically asks whether there's a role for pediatricians to be involved in inculcating an interest in their patient population who would like to go into the medical profession, and how can they best ignite that interest?
I think physicians in general and pediatricians in particular have the opportunity to offer words of encouragement. Pediatricians do well child exams, particularly as children get older or become school age. Tell me what you like in school. Tell me a little bit of what, and to offer academic encouragement, to really give children a sense that the pediatrician, the physician, sees that they have potential, and to encourage them in their academic work, to ask them what they would like to do when they grow up. Had they ever thought about being a physician? Those are just planting seeds, because no one, if you don't live around physicians and no one sees potential in you, there are many, many stories that individuals tell about the teacher who saw the potential in them, or the mentor, or the Boy Scout leader, or the the pastor or the, person who ran the, a community business. I think it's important that we encourage young people, support their hope, and ideally plant seeds of possibility as it relates to future careers and aspirations.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Monroe. And I just want to add one comment, I think, which is the other 800-pound gorilla in the room that I don't think we've touched upon. And that is, does the pediatrician, and I'm going to put it with reference to the pediatrician, does the pediatrician really have time to engage in those conversations with their patients? And I often ask medical students this question. I have a very close friend who is a very successful gastroenterologist who decided not to get his license renewed because he said, this is not what I was trained to do medicine for, because he was being chided for not getting enough REUs or whatever the mnemonics is for the amount of time he spent with patients. So I think I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Monroe, that I think pediatricians and physicians in general can play a very important community role, but is our system allowing them to do what they were really trained to do?
I think
Answer to that is no, it's not.
No,
some of you may know I have a book, Time to Heal, which goes into that point directly, that we have incentives in our system that are contrary to professional and human values. And that's a huge existential threat to the quality of care in the future, independent of issues of equity and race that we've been talking about today.
Okay, I'm sorry I got on my little soapbox, but I'm going to turn to another question. How could partnering with medical centers within specific underrepresented groups and neighborhoods be maximized to begin to break down the biases early and to help those students/humans earlier to not experience the inequities, but also to support them from the bottom up into college-bound years?
Well, schools have not taken a strong interest in their community other than as a source of land for expansion of their physical plant. And this is at the same time a great opportunity going forward to really work with the communities and to realize that a medical school is of the community and to make that part of its identity and value system as well as part of its mission. And there have been some successful experiments already of medical schools supporting an elementary school or health clinics in an area. And I would just say we need a lot more of that.
Dr. Capuso, do you have any comments on that?
For many years now, I've actually experienced Brown University being a less than ideal neighbor to the rest of Providence, although there's a long history of the education department here being involved in public education in Providence and in Rhode Island. Public education is hugely problematic here, and the involvement of Brown doesn't seem to have fixed very much. It's funny because we're also home to the Rhode Island School of Design, and the Rhode Island School of Design, by comparison to Brown, is a terrific neighbor. Had a profound effect on public education in Rhode Island.
Thank you. I'm going to end with Dr. Bilash's question. Is outpatient primary care medicine, and I think you had an earlier question that sort of touched upon this, is outpatient primary care medicine now largely a non-physician activity requiring no training in hospitals as resident physicians? What is the role for academically trained PhD nurses?
So as a board certified family physician, I will take that on, but I'll perhaps take it on in a slightly different way than perhaps posed by the questioner. First of all, I think that there is not enough access to primary care and nationally, number one. Number two, family physicians are still trained both in the hospital and in outpatient areas. That's not going to go away. There are many rural communities that depend on family medicine all over the country, but also urban underserved communities, and frankly, suburban well-served communities also depend on family medicine physicians and other primary care physicians, number one. Do I believe that, again, it's not usually PhD nurses, it may be a doctor of nursing practice. So certainly I do believe that people should be able to practice at the top of their license. I realize many of our specialty societies don't believe that. Certainly in the state of Texas and other states where I've practiced, there's a lot of pushback to independent practice. However, there are complexities. The training is not ideal. All primary care, quite frankly, isn't simple. It is not a cold, an immunization, or a sore throat. Most of the people who have seen a complex specialist still need a primary physician to actually help them integrate their care. So I perceive that there is room enough for pharmacists and for nurse practitioners and for primary care physicians. I do believe primary care physicians are underpaid and underappreciated. I think there is continues to be a perverse incentive in medicine such that specialties are disproportionately compensated, where those thinking professions or those thinking disciplines, not so much. There are many disciplines and subspecialties in medicine and pediatrics that frankly are considered lost leaders because they're necessary for tertiary and quaternary care. However, they do not generate a bottom line. They're not positive bottom line generating specialties, but necessary to the armamentarium of comprehensive high quality care in any health system. So I don't believe it is an either or with regard to primary care, but I believe that we need to think smarter and we need to develop more integrated models of care that actually serve the needs of the community and are much more patient and family centered. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, Erica, I hope you're capturing all these questions because I'm not sure we will be able to address all of them, but I think it'll be good to put them on the site. And I don't know if people are interested in answering the questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Chambers. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And this has been a great session. I really want to personally thank each of the speakers for your insights.
Thank you very much, Mina. And thank you, all of the speakers. This symposium has far exceeded my aspirations and gives me lots of joy. It will soon be online for everybody to look at as you please and to think about. For the students who are out there, and I know there are lots because it is a mandatory exercise for them, you have learned or have been given lots of information that speaks to many of the issues we have discussed in class. Think about them, and we will talk about them in great detail. For all of us, thank you all. The next symposium in this series is going to be on January 20th, in which we will all speak to the issue of building excellence in the continuum of medical education, with once again a terrific group of experts in the field. And with that, I can only say thank you all, good night, and good luck.